The Book of Esther. This book reads like a movie script more than any other book in the Bible. God is not mentioned once in Esther, yet his fingerprints can be seen all throughout the story. Esther was the adopted younger cousin of Mordecai. They were Jewish exiles living in the capital of the Persian Empire, Susa. King Ahasuerus is believed to be Xerxes, the same Persian king from the movie 300 who attacked Sparta. The villain of this story is Haman. Timeline-wise, the stories in this book came before Ezra chapter 7 and all of Nehemiah. We don't know who wrote the book of Esther. It may have been Mordecai, but we don't know for sure. The main theme of Esther is the providence of God. Providence means the protective, unseen care of God. The protective, unseen care of God. God is not mentioned in this book, and yet he is seen so clearly. For this video, I'm going to summarize the chapters and try and point out details you may have missed. As Esther chapter 1 is pretty straightforward. This first chapter describes how great Xerxes' kingdom was. This chapter takes place in the 3rd year of his reign, which was before his fateful attack against Greece's Sparta, which greatly humbled him and his kingdom. Esther 2. Chapter 2, from verse 16 of this chapter, we see that this beauty pageant and Esther becoming queen all took place after Xerxes' attack against Sparta. Xerxes at this point has not just been shown up by his wife or his previous wife in chapter 1, but his massive army was greatly humbled by the little town of Sparta in Greece. So this beauty pageant and choosing of a new wife was likely thought up as a way to comfort him. Women were chosen and beautified for a whole year before going before him. Likely this was to make sure they weren't pregnant. They had to wait a whole year. Each woman would sleep with him, and he would send them away in the morning. A year of beauty treatments might sound nice, but if the woman wasn't chosen by the king, then after one night of sleeping with him, she was put in a harem and left to live single the rest of her life. It's a horrible life for the rejected women. As for Esther, she was an orphaned Jewish exile who had been adopted by her cousin Mordecai. When the beauty pageant was formed, Esther was taken, likely forcibly, in verse 8, to be a part of it. Mordecai instructs her during this time, and she's obedient, gaining the favor of the king's servants. Esther is told by Mordecai to hide her Jewish heritage, and this may have led to her having to compromise in obeying God's law by eating pork or other unclean food. She would also have to sleep with the king and try and win his favor. Esther had 2 choices in this. 1, keep her identity hidden and go through everything, including sleeping with the king, hoping to win his favor. Or 2, reveal her identity, fight the system, and likely be executed. Mordecai advises her to keep her identity hidden and just go with it. So Esther is like a secret agent in this story. And we don't read anywhere in this book of God being upset at her for what she chooses to do. Instead, it seems God was actually behind this decision. The fact that Xerxes would choose Esther, this orphaned, adopted Jewish exile, I believe showed that God was in every detail of this story. At the end of this chapter, we read of Mordecai discovering a plot against Xerxes, and the men who wanted to kill Xerxes are caught. This will be important later in the story. Moving on to chapter 3. Chapter 3, the villain of Esther is introduced, Haman the Agagite. We only read of one other Agag in the Bible in 1 Samuel 15, the king of the Amalekites who was hacked to pieces by the prophet Samuel. The Amalekites were the enemies of God and of Israel starting in Exodus chapter 17. King Saul was instructed to kill all of the Amalekites but had disobeyed. Haman, this villain, feels slighted by Mordecai for not honoring him, and he makes a decree that all the Jews, all the exiles of Judah, including the children, are to be slaughtered and annihilated. So just this little offense that Haman feels from Mordecai not honoring him causes him to want to slaughter all of the Jews. And this is to happen during the last month of the year. Can you imagine how all the Jewish exiles felt when they heard about this decree? The Persian Empire was the greatest empire in the world up to this point in history. It was pretty much impossible for the Jews to be able to flee from this decree. Esther chapter 4. All the Jews weep and they fast and they cry out to God, but Esther keeps her identity hidden and does not weep. Mordecai calls upon her to do something, but Esther responds in fear in verse 11. People were only supposed to go before the king if the king summons them. Otherwise, they were likely to be put to death. The king had not summoned Esther for 30 days, and she was scared that she would be executed. Mordecai responds with faith in God's providence in verse 14. He says, "For if you keep silent at this time, relief and deliverance will rise for the Jews from another place, but you and your father's house will perish. And who knows whether you have not come to the kingdom for such a time as this?" Mordecai knew that God would not fully abandon his people. God had made promises to Abraham and to David that he would keep. But Mordecai also knew that if Esther chose to live by fear rather than live by faith, that she and Mordecai would likely perish. Esther responds to Mordecai with a request for everyone to fast and pray on her behalf for 3 days. She knew she didn't have the faith to act in the moment, but she also knew the power of prayer and fasting, and she believed that God would give her the faith that she needed as they fasted. Well done, Esther, and well done, Mordecai. Chapter 5, Esther ends up winning favor when she approaches the king and she invites him and the villain Haman to a feast. For some reason, Esther doesn't have the courage to confront Haman during the feast, so at the end of the feast, she asks the king and Haman to join her for another feast the next day. Haman is initially elated at the invite, but his bitterness towards Mordecai kills his joy. In verse 13, he exclaims, "Yet all this is worth nothing to me, so long as I see Mordecai the Jew sitting at the king's gate." Bitterness, unforgiveness, and envy all kill joy. Haman has such hate towards Mordecai that despite knowing Mordecai and all the Jews will soon be exterminated, he still can't be happy. So following the advice of his friends, he makes a huge gallows to kill Mordecai on in the morning. This is where we see God's providence and sovereignty in an amazing way in the next chapter. Chapter 6. Haman rises early to go ask the king for Mordecai's death, but little does he know that the king hasn't been able to sleep all night. Likely to help the king fall asleep, the king asks for the chronicles, or the journals of memorable deeds, to be read before him. Mordecai's story from the end of chapter 2 is shared with the king in the middle of the night, and the king feels a desire in his heart to honor Mordecai. As he gets this desire, who should walk in but Haman? And he asks Haman, how should the king honor a man that he desires to honor? And Haman gives this elaborate way, thinking that he's the one that's about to be honored. But instead, the king orders Haman to go out and to honor Mordecai in the exact way that Haman himself wanted to be honored. This is such humiliation for Haman, and he loses a chance to ask for Mordecai's death. And actually, the tables are completely turned on him. This story shows that though the devil may try to make intricate plans to destroy us, God is over the devil, and he is able to turn all of the devil's plans against him. Proverbs 26:27 reads, "Whoever digs a pit will fall into it." This is exactly what is happening to Haman. Esther chapter 7. During the second feast, Esther gets the courage to finally speak up to the king and reveal Haman's plot. The king is shaken and he leaves for a moment. And in this moment, Haman falls before Esther begging for mercy. But when the king returns and he sees Haman the way he's falling upon Esther, he thinks that Haman is trying to sexually assault his wife Esther. This enrages the king and he commands Haman to be executed. They end up killing him on the same huge gallows that Haman had made to kill Mordecai. Almost all Bible translations read, "They hanged Haman." But most scholars believe that instead of being hung by a noose, which most of us are familiar with, instead, Haman was pulled down from a high point of the gallows, pulled down onto a stake that was pointing up, and his body went through it, and the stake went up through his body, out his neck, impaling him. This gruesome form of execution preceded the crucifixion, which was the way Jesus was executed. Again, Proverbs 26:27 reads, "Whoever digs a pit will fall into it." The very gallows Haman made for Mordecai ended up being the gallows where Haman was executed. Chapter 8. Esther is now filled with newfound confidence and faith. In verse 3, she falls at the feet of the king and weeps and pleads with him for the edict against the Jews to be canceled. A few chapters earlier, Esther feared even approaching the king, and she needed them to fast for 3 days before she could go before him. But now she feels boldness and confidence to just cry at his feet. The king exalts Mordecai, and together they write a new edict that the Jews may kill all of their enemies before that fateful day was to come. He basically reversing the previous edict. Esther chapter 9. In verse 3, we read that the fear of Mordecai had fallen on all the officials and people of power in the empire, so that they respected and readily obeyed all of his commands. God is able to exalt his people even in the most wicked of empires. Joseph was exalted in Egypt, Daniel was exalted in Babylon, and Mordecai is exalted in Persia. All three became the number 2 of some of the greatest empires in history. Beginning in verse 20, we read about the Feast of Purim being set for the Jews to celebrate. This is a feast that Jews still celebrate today. At the end of verse 22, we read that on this holiday they should feast, be glad, and send gifts to one another and gifts to the poor. This is similar to how Christmas is celebrated for Christians, although I think we need to take note of the instruction to also give gifts to the poor. There are days of the year, whether it's Christmas, Easter, or other days, that we need to set apart to gather and feast, be joyful, and even exchange gifts. And we should always remember the poor and give to them in joy, like ministry that I direct does every Christmas when we give gifts to the orphans. Esther chapter 10. In verse 3, we read that Mordecai was great among his people because he sought the welfare of his people and spoke peace to them. Mordecai was a blessed shepherd of God's people. He cared for them. He spoke peace to them. I hope you enjoyed this story. I hope you enjoyed reading this book of Esther. God bless you as you continue to read his word.